We hear a lot of perspectives on the Mankind podcast. Inclusion of a guest is not an endorsement of their views, and the opinions expressed here do not always represent the mission or values of the Mankind Project USA.
Looks like the rain has gone.
G'day and welcome to the Mankind Podcast, the show where we break the molds of modern manhood to prove there's more than one way to be a man. I'm your host, Brandon Clift, and it's great to be back. Man, it's been a slight hiatus for us. Me and my now wife, Christine, were able to get away to Mexico and tie the knot finally. Important to us to do so before our little one comes along in November. And also, we had just bought and sold a house, so just at the tail end of the moving process. Grateful to be sleeping in a mattress instead of on the floor, and eating dinner at a table instead of on the floor as we slowly start to unpack things and get a rhythm. So I'm grateful to be back. Definitely a couple crazy weeks there that required our attention, and so I wanted to come back really with a bang. In fact, this is going to be a two-part episode just because of how big it is. I'm telling you, it's thick. Man, this is a thick episode. As I interview Richard Wiener, the author of Survivor's Odyssey, From Oppression to Reconciliation. Now I tell you, buckle up. I am so moved by having gotten to spend time with this man. Richard, as a young boy, was able to escape Nazi Germany. He was grown up in the town of Wittenberg in Germany. He was the only Jew in a school full of Hitler youth. He was tormented, he was bullied, he was terrorized. His father was arrested under no grounds and thrown into a concentration camp. He was forced to flee, separated from his parents, and made his way to America. And his story is absolutely phenomenal, to go from those incredibly tough beginnings to a man now at the age of 95 years old who has forgiveness in his heart for those who oppressed him, for those who tormented him, for those that vilified and really wanted to erase him. This man, I believe, could hold the key to many of us who may find ourselves feeling that division, feeling that anger, that disdain, that distaste for those on whatever spectrum you choose to see yourself or view yourself on. My conversation with Richard covers a lot of territory, talking about, of course, his story, his forgiveness journey to eventually heading back to Germany to meet many of the students who once tormented him, students who once fought for the Nazis. So remarkable stuff. Absolutely, you're going to laugh, you're likely going to cry, and you're going to enjoy this time spent with Richard. And hopefully it gives you and me an opportunity to really identify how easy it is to dehumanize those whom we don't agree with. Whatever spectrum you're looking at it from, whatever disagreements you have with perhaps how this country is run, perhaps your religious or political views on things. This time spent with Richard was phenomenal for me to finally just get grounded and start to separate some of those lenses in which I'm choosing to look at people that are different from myself. So you're going to love this one. This being part one of my interview with Richard Wiener. Enjoy. G'day and welcome to another episode of the Mankind Podcast, the show where we break the molds of modern manhood to prove there's more than one way to be a man. I am going to kick things off with just checking in and sharing my excitement and my fear in conducting a conversation and discussion, an interview based on the topics and our guest, Richard Wiener, joining us today, as we're going to be talking about the power of forgiveness and reconciliation. We're going to be talking about Richard's remarkable story of surviving Nazi-era Germany. And I perhaps some of my eloquence may not be here today, but based on our conversation so far, Richard, you've been able to settle a lot of those fears. So I'm grateful to have you here, and welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Brandon, and welcome to the podcast, all of my MKP brothers. It's good to be here to have a chance to talk to you because I've got quite a story to tell, which will illustrate what Brandon just said, that there's a vast variety of ways of being a man. So here goes. I was born in 1927, and you're present at my imminent 95th birthday, which is going to happen this next Sunday.
95.
And I'm still alive, walking around and kicking out some dust too. So I was born in a small town that's world famous called Wittenberg. Those of you who happen to be Lutheran will know that this is the cradle of Protestantism, where Martin Luther started the Protestant Reformation. It's a historic town that was founded in the 13th century. So it's over 700 years old. And that's where I was born and where I spent the first almost 12 years of my life. Now, it so happened that when my first school day coincided with the seizing of power by the Nazi regime, Adolf Hitler, you may know about. And I was only a small kid. I didn't know what that meant. But in Wittenberg, my grandfather owned a small shoe factory. And on that day, I saw guards posted outside the shoe factory asking passersby not to buy from Jews. I didn't know what that meant. You know, I was just too young. But as time went by, with every passing year, there were tighter and tighter restrictions against Jewish life in my hometown, as indeed all over Germany. So, for example, when it came time for me to leave elementary school, which happened when I was about 10, there was a quota of 1% to go to the town's Latin school, which is the school that you'd had to go to if you wanted to eventually go to university. I was that 1%. By that time, the kids were all about, 10, 11 years old, and they were beginning to join the, I call it the Cub Scout part of the Hitler Youth. The Hitler Youth, you had to be 12, as in Boy Scouts, but you could be in the Jungvolk. Jungvolk was the young Hitler Youth. So all my classmates, with one exception I'll come to later, joined the Hitler Youth, and on national holidays, they would come to school in their brown-shirted uniforms with a swastika armband, and I would be the only one in civvies. And during recess, which I always dreaded, we had recess in the morning we were out in the schoolyards for a little recreation. I was always isolated in the schoolyard. Nobody wanted to be associated with a dirty Jew. You know, they call me names. They say, you shouldn't even be here. Who let you in? You dirty Jew. And some of the more rabid bully boys would throw pebbles at me and stuff little obscene notes into my pockets. And it was always like, I'm different. I'm an outcast. I don't belong. And that characterized how I saw myself. My self-image was that of someone who's somehow or other inadequate, less than, in fact, to some people, despisable. And I know in my experience in MKP, I see other men who have similar self-images, even though from a very different source. But somehow they got the message from somewhere that they're not all they should be, or that they're not to be associated with, and so forth. Anyway, that's just a prologue to my whole life story.
Wow.
So a year and a half went by, and then came an event that I will never forget. In fact, it's almost a well-known in world history. It's called Crystal Night. In German, it's Kristallnacht, also known as the Night of Broken Glass. On that occasion, there was kind of what you'd call a pogrom, where all the synagogues in Germany were set on fire. All the Jewish homes and businesses were destroyed, looted. Jews were forced to move out of their homes into a Jewish home with another Jewish family. All the adult men were arrested and sent to concentration camp. it was considered the opening salvo of the Holocaust. You've heard of the Holocaust, right?
Yeah, of course.
Which is eventually about 7 million Jews were murdered in the death camps. So on that day, just to time capsule here, I came home for lunch. There was a religion class once a week, from which I was excused because I'm Jewish. I went home. We happened to live across the street from the school. And I saw my mother crying at the kitchen table. I said, "What's the matter, Mom?" She said, "Your father's been arrested." I said, "But why?" She had no idea. So then she was just cooking something to take to him. He was still in the town jail. When a couple of men arrived from the power company, they said, "Sorry, but we have instructions to turn off your gas and electric," which they did. Now it was November 9th, 1938, as a matter of fact, date I will never forget. And it gets dark early in November, and we were alone. We didn't know what was going to happen next. I happened to have an aunt and uncle down the block at the other end of Luther Street, where I lived, and we decided to go down there because we were afraid to be alone. So when we got there, my uncle had also been arrested. My aunt, my cousin Manfred, who's the same age as I, and two old grandparents were sitting in the living room by candlelight and wondering what would come next, Came next was a rock crashing through the window. They lived one flight up, was a bay window. Well, rock came crashing through. I went to the window. The street was black with people. Some were carrying torches, flickering torches. There were a whole bunch of them yelling up, "You dirty Jews, your time has come." And we didn't know what that meant. Were they going to kill us all? Next thing you know, a knock on the front door, a man from the Gestapo, the secret police. "Sorry, I'm here to search the apartment for weapons." My aunt happened to have a very large, beautiful apartment, and he went from room to room, checking under the mattresses and everywhere. Of course, didn't find any weapons. It was not customary in Germany to have weapons, as it is in this country. And eventually, they were knocking on the door, and my mother said, "Please don't open the door." He said, "Well, I'm through here." And he opens the door, and about a dozen young guys, we knew from the neighborhood, they weren't in uniform or anything, but they were like teenagers, kind of hot to trot, kind of, and they had come with axes and knives, and they went from room to room, smashing all the furniture to smithereens, pushing over the china cabinet. I still remember that crash, and all my aunt's crystal and stemware was lying in shards on the floor, and they herded us all out into the corridor. And when I was 11, I will never forget this, I had an axe swung over my head. And believe me, I thought my last hour had come. I mean, what else? Why would they do that? And I don't know how long the carnage took. Probably not more than an hour, I estimate, but it seemed like an eternity. I was 11 years old. What did I know? And of course, my father wasn't there. This is a big piece. My father was not there. And when your father is not there for you, and despite all the great reasons that he was taken to concentration camp, nonetheless, if you don't have your father, it's a big deal, especially for boys, as some of you may have already noticed. And that characterized some of the aftermath of how I experienced my life. That at the most critical time in my life, my father was not there. And for the longest time, I did not really, I was a child. I did not really go into what that meant to him, that he was having a worst possible experience of his life in Buchenwald concentration camp. As a child, I only thought in terms of me, right? Well, what did it do for me? And my mother, how could she cope? It turned out he was in Buchenwald for 3 months. So what came next is, following morning, our mothers decided to send us, me and my cousin Manfred, out to see what had happened to the other Jews. It's a small town. There's only about, I think at that time, it had about 25,000 people. One main street, most of the stores were on the main street, Kollegienstraße. And so we went downtown, and all the people that we encountered on the way there averted their eyes because they were probably embarrassed. They probably knew what had happened the night before, and they were embarrassed to look us in the face. And we felt like we no longer belong here. We're an outcast. We're no longer Wittenbergers. We get to the main street, and of course, all the Jewish shops, there were a number of them, about maybe 4 or 5, mostly clothing stores, and they had all been, the windows smashed, a big sign, Jude, don't fight, with the Star of David, painted on the window, if it was, to the extent it was still there. And all the contents had been looted. And that's it. We returned back to our mothers. Then one of my classmates came over and said, Richard, I've been asked to tell you, don't come back to school. You've been, kicked out. Well, that was no big surprise. And so from that time on, I was no longer in school. Then we were told our apartment was confiscated and given to a Nazi family. And we had to move in with another mother and son in their home. Their father was also arrested. And that's where I lived for the next 3 months. And during those 3 months, I couldn't go out in the street. We couldn't go out in the street during the daytime because it had become legal to kill Jews. No punishment. If you want to gun down a Jew, go ahead and do it. The less Jews we have, the better. And that's how I lived for the next 3 months. And then came, miracle of miracles, the news that the international community, I think mostly Britain, had arranged for what they called a Kindertransport, which would be the child rescue operation that Britain, unlike most of the other European countries, had agreed to take in up to 10,000 Jewish kids on the condition that they either had a parent in concentration camp or relatives or somebody in England who would take them in, to live with them. I happened to have both because I had an aunt and uncle that had migrated to England in the early 1930s, who lived in London, and my Aunt Betty and Uncle Max, and who agreed to take us in. And so next thing I knew, I was on a train with my mother and my cousin and his mother to Berlin to take the boat train to Hamburg, which is a port city, and then to go to England. And I still remember sitting on that train, seeing the roofs of my hometown disappearing behind me, and I had tears in my eyes. I was leaving everything behind that I had known in my life. My school, my home, my future, my country, my city, my town, and not knowing I was going into an unknown future. I didn't know where I was going to land. And I knew my mother wasn't going to be able to go with me. Let me just take a sip of water, if you will indulge me.
Absolutely.
So now we get to Berlin. Big city, hustle and bustle, and we have to change trains because we came on a local train from Wittenberg, and we had to catch an express train to Hamburg, which was then Germany's second largest city, and at a port. And I still remember my mother saying goodbye to me, and then they kind of hustled me away from her. I saw her. I wanted to give her one more hug, I saw tears running down her face, and I was in tears. And I wanted to give her one more hug, but it was too late. And they hustled us onto the boat train, and off we went. And we left Wittenberg, and we went across the whole northeast Germany, and we landed in Hamburg. And we spent the first night in a shelter, some kind of a place they had rigged up. And then the next morning, we took the boat, all refugee kids, through Southampton, England, that southern port, and changed to a train to London. And I thought, I was hoping there'd be somewhere my aunt and uncle would be there to meet us in London, but who knew? What if they missed the date or anything? We were totally at sea, so to speak, and didn't know what was going to happen. But when we arrived there, they were. My Aunt Betty, who was my favorite aunt, she gave me a big hug and she said, "Now you can feel safe now." And as I say in my biography, and I tried to believe her, because it doesn't happen that quickly, after the trauma of, that long a time. Let's see, how long did I live under the Nazi regime? 11 and a half. About 5.5 years I lived under the Nazi regime in constant anxiety, if not terror. And here we were suddenly in England. And I thought, well, it's a relief to be there, but let's wait and see what happens.
Mm-hmm.
I lived with my aunt and uncle. My father was still in concentration camp at that point. And a few weeks later, the phone rang. And my aunt said, "It's for you." I have to stop a minute at this point. I always tear up, even now. All these years later, I still tear up. And it was my father. And I realized that I had not really expected to ever see him again or hear from him again. But there he was. He'd gotten out of Buchenwald after 3 months there in the wintertime. He weighed 90 pounds. They had shaved his head. And later on, he told me a little bit about life in Buchenwald, but I really couldn't possibly know what he went through, the terror of every day, being beaten, starved, whatever. Well, probably seen, I don't know, Schindler's List or some of those movies. It was just a challenge, but he did escape with his life. And eventually my parents were able to get out of Germany and join me in England. And we all lived in my aunt and uncle's house in London. They happened to have a very beautiful big house. And they had about 12 refugees living there on mattresses, and just to get them out of Germany. And then on September 1st, World War II started in Europe. And the bombing of London started soon after that. And my school, I went to an ordinary school with working class English kids. And we were evacuated from London. And I was taken to a small town called Hemel Hempstead, about, I'd say maybe 30 miles out of London, and boarded with an elderly English couple who had agreed to take in some kids. They probably got paid for that to some extent, but I remember the time the teachers took us around up the street, Belmont Street, and stopped at each house that had agreed to take on some children. And we stopped at one house. There were 3 of us refugee Jewish kids. And the woman in that house had asked for 3 kids. But when she heard that we were little Jewish refugees, she says, "Oh, heavens, no, not little German Jewish refugees. I would never." So it was like being back in Germany.
Gosh.
He just said, never you mind. They went up to the next house, this elderly couple, Mr. and Mrs. Viles. I'll never forget them. They are enshrined in my pantheon of memory, I like to say. They were so kind and so good to us. And the teacher rang the bell, and Melanie Viles came to the door and was confronted with these three little boys when she had asked for two girls. But when she heard what had happened at her neighbor's house, she just melted away and she said, "Come on in and have a cuppa." Which they said like a cup of tea. You called it a cuppa in England. And next thing was sitting in their living room having a cup of tea and talking like a Brit. We learned how, because I lived in England, I talk British English, not American, as you may be able to detect. And we lived with the Vileses for a whole year. They had a 2-bedroom house. All you had was two bedrooms upstairs. They had one, and the three of us kids lived in the other. And then there was a living room, well, sort of a living room, I guess with a table to eat, a kitchen, a small kitchen, and upstairs there was a bathroom. And then there was one other room downstairs. There were only 2 rooms downstairs. One of them was the special room that they only used when the vicar came to tea, which was about once or twice a year. And it reminded me of people who, poor people who have just one good outfit that they save only for weddings and funerals. That's how that was. So we lived with them for a year. I went to school there and with, ordinary working class kids. And it was not perfect, but it was a hell of a lot better than being in Nazi Germany. And the war was going on, and eventually, actually, I left England before America got into the war. We left a year later because my father had applied for visas to both America and to what was then Palestine, and with the idea that we would go to whichever visas came through first because, time was of the essence. And as it happened, the American visas came through in July 1940. And the war, America got into the war, as you know, on Pearl Harbor Day, which was in September of that year, right? Is that right?
December.
Or was it for? I'm sorry, December 7th, right? December 7th of that year. So we left England in July, and I think it was the last passenger ship. I was told it was the last passenger ship to cross the Atlantic during the U-boat campaign, which was going on. It was the submarine campaign where the Germans were sinking ships. And ours was a British ship, Cunard line, called the Cameronia. And it had a sister ship, the Caledonia, had already been sunk. Therefore, it was a fraught voyage. We were blacked out at night. We carried life preservers with us all day. And we were just, afraid that we too might be sunk. And, well, it was just a thought too dreadful to even bear, to think about a lot. So we just assumed that we would get to New York safely. And the food was good. I mean, life otherwise was fine. And I think it took us 10 days to get to New York. And I will never forget, this is another memory moment of mine, when we arrived in New York Harbor and saw the Statue of Liberty. Everybody was on deck. This whole all the refugee passengers were on deck. And when we saw the Statue of Liberty, we were down on our knees, thanking God to have reached the promised land. It was an unforgettable moment, of course, in my life. And finally, that weight that had been only partly lifted in England, totally lifted. And then I started safe to be in America, which was and I hate to say it, to some extent still is, the land of the free and the home of the brave. And more about the latter part later, but as you can tell by just these few words, that I don't feel quite as safe here as I did in the beginning, but still optimistic, shall we say. So we're on the dock. Picture this large pier where the ship had just arrived, and there were large lettered signs above the alphabetical, A, B, C, and we sat under the sign W because my family name is Wiener. And with all we had was a big crate, which contained bedding and some cutlery and stuff like that, because the rest of our belongings that my father had, it's another long story. My father had bought a lot of furniture for exile after he managed to sell part of the equipment of my grandfather's shoe factory. He had used the money to buy furniture for a sewing machine for my mother to use when we got to America, because we expected to have very little possessions, very few possessions. So here we sat under the W sign, and gradually the whole pier emptied. We were sitting there all alone. The distant relatives that were supposed to pick us up had not arrived. And here we were, a sweltering July day in New York, and alone in the promised land. There's a book right all by itself. Maybe I'll write that. And eventually a bus came from a homeless shelter and took us in. It was particularly for refugees, and we spent the first night in a shelter. And then my distant relatives showed up. Actually, she was the second wife of my mother's divorced father and her second husband. So we didn't really know them, but they were sort of relatives, and they did take us home, and they had found a place for my parents to stay with neighbors, and I stayed with them for a few weeks. And then we found a place to live, sublet, a couple of furnished rooms with another refugee family in Brooklyn, New York. And that's where we lived for the next few years. And so began my life in America.
I hope you're enjoying the Mankind Podcast. The Mankind Project supports all kinds of men with men's groups and programs aimed at building self-awareness, improving relationships, and upping your game. If you're willing to take the next step and you're a man of color, check out the men's work for BIPOC men. Find out more in the show notes.
I still remember my first day in school, junior high school, 7th grade, John Pershing Junior High School in Brooklyn. And I arrived, and I was wearing short pants, as is customary in Europe, till into your teens. And I still remember all the kids standing at a distance, looking at me in my short pants. They were all wearing, in those days, people wore knickers. These are kind of sort of long pants with little, I don't know how to describe them, as they're elastic that held them down. And they started pointing at me, laughing, because here was this 13-year-old kid wearing short pants. And I went home. I said, "I'm not going back to school unless you buy me a pair of knickers." So they went to Woolworths. That was the 5 and dime in those days. They bought me the cheapest, because we had no money. Bought me a pair of knickers. That didn't last very long. They wore out at the knees very quickly, but at least they saved my honor and my pride. So I was able to go to school in knickers.
There you go.
And so started my life in America. And in fact, I became a minor celebrity. I remember at Christmas time, I was sent around to speak to other classes in the school about, just briefly, about my my history, having escaped from Nazi Germany. The point of that was to teach the kids how grateful they should be to have the life they had, how they could have it much worse. So eventually I even, for ninth grade vice president, although I lost to a very homely girl, and I still remember, Gilda so far was her name.
Mm.
So that was that. Meanwhile, in Brooklyn, you had to make a choice whom to hang with.
Yeah.
So there were three groups, and it was very, very ethnically separate. You could hang out either with the Italians, with the Scandinavians, or with the Jews. Well, guess which one I chose?
Yeah.
Most of the Jews were Eastern European Jews, and they considered us German Jews to be arrogant, think we're better than they are, which of course we are.
No. Richard, your shadow's showing.
I know. I just did that to kind of
Of course.
have a little bit of a wise guy in me. You'll catch that as I go along.
You're in good company. Don't worry.
So I picked the Scandinavians, who to me were the good Germans in a way. They had some of the qualities of Germans, the good qualities, without being, racists. I mean, at least they weren't visibly racist. And my best friend was lived next door, Al Christopherson, and we were pals. And he was my best friend, and he had a little group of other kids, and they were Lutherans. They went to church regularly, and we went ice skating on Central Park Lake, and they taught me how to play baseball and football, touch football. And I was a very fast runner. In fact, I eventually ended up running a relay in Madison Square Garden in New York, and so we would play pickup games in Brooklyn, and I would usually carry the ball because I could run fast and dodge them, And I felt almost normal. I felt almost like a real boy, like it was like Pinocchio when he became a real boy. And so that was reasonably good times. And they all went to a place called Brooklyn Technical High School, which was a special school. You had to qualify for it. And I wanted to go with my buddies. And so that's where I went. Even though I'm not a techie at all, as your host can witness by my difficulty in having an internet connection, all the way to today. But I did go to Brooklyn Tech, and eventually I turned 18, and there was a draft. The war had started. There was a draft, and I got to finish high school at 18 and a half, and then I was drafted into the U.S. Army.
Richard,
and I spent,
just quickly, before we move further, I want to ask you, it's a commonly held belief that in the Second World War kind of era of our history in the United States, that there wasn't anti-Semitism happening because of us being in the Allies, which I hear you chuckle to that. I just briefly, I mean, even though it escaped such horrors, were you still met with resistance and the same prejudices, the same judgments when you made it to America?
Oh yeah, not by everybody, no, but there were. At that time, the famous figure was Father Coughlin. He was a Catholic priest, and he was on the radio. We didn't have TV in those days. On the radio all the time, preaching his gospel of hatred, and particularly about Jews. And in Germany, the tagline, there was an anti-Semitic newspaper posted on the street, and the tagline was, "The Jews are our misfortune." And they always showed Jews, little ugly Jews, lusting after Aryan virgins, blonde virgins, and someone had a gun in their hands, the Jewish murderer, which was really, so in this country, it was a little more subtle. The Jews were the ones who were they were dominating, they were all the money grubbers, and, they were seizing all the money they could in America, and they were, so that was a nightly broadcast, Father Coughlin. And then when I got in the Army, there were a lot of kids from the hinterland, from places, and I don't want to mention Tennessee because I know that's where you live, right,
Yeah.
Brandon? So I don't want to demonize Tennessee, but from mid-America, right? And they were mostly rural people that were not, and they not only were down on Jews in particular, but all the elite city boys who thought they were better, and Jews were part of that, Jews, and they had a lot of nasty things to say. This was during basic training, and I thought it wasn't very comfortable, but they weren't really in my face that much, so we were able to get through. Basic training was only 8 weeks, after which we were separated. I stayed in this country, and I was transferred to my base in Southern Virginia, Fort Eustis. And as a matter of fact, I happened to, there was something called AGCT test, Army General Classification Test. And it so happened that I had the highest score in Fort Eustis, which meant that I had my pick of jobs, which was really nice. So the job I picked was as a lecturer, an information and education lecturer. I went around to different companies and lectured them on various subjects, including including occupation ethics. If you're sent to Germany or Japan, here's how you need to act. You don't want to, you know what I mean? That was one of them. But the other one was about the Nazis, about what had happened in Germany.
Right.
And there was a movie that we showed, which I'll always remember. It started out beautifully with an orchestra playing Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto. You know, Mendelssohn, of course, was a Jew. And then it went into, it said, so then the voiceover was Germany, a cultured country. Then it segued over to housewives scrubbing the cobblestones in Hamburg, a clean country. And then it showed ships sailing out of Hamburg port, a prosperous country, and an educated country. All the good things you could say about the Germans. And then suddenly there was a shift, a segue to a heap of skulls outside a concentration camp. And it was like a shock, and how did this prosperous, clean, educated country become that country? It's like, which is a question that was often asked at the time, you know?
Yeah.
How could this cultivated country of Goethe and Schiller and, Beethoven and, Brahms and all these famous people turn into a country of murderous beasts that killed 7 million people in death camps? And all the German people witnessed that, after all. And then you go into the explanation about the history of militarism and all that led up to that time. And it became, it wasn't that the kings and the emperors of previous history did those things, but they also had a lot of anti-Semitism. So Jews were put into a separate category because Jews essentially were doomed to go to hell eventually. So it was okay for them to handle money, which was sinful for Christians to do. So the Jews were the bankers, the money lenders, and all that. They could charge interest because they were damned anyway, right?
Yeah.
Might as well be hanged for a sheep as for a lamb, as they say, right? And so we were the business class more than some of the Germans. Some of the largest department stores in Berlin were owned by Jews. In Wittenberg, my grandfather was in better days. He was on the board of, what was it called, the board of the business board of Wittenberg, and he was respected as such. You know, he hung out. In fact, before the Nazis, my father was in the tennis club and in the bowling league, so we were still quasi normal, and that all, of course, changed when the Nazis came to power.
And you mentioned, Richard, in the book that, especially when you were going to early school, that many locals, many non-Jewish German locals, would share their anti-Semitic beliefs, but they would say, but not the Wieners.
Exactly.
But not the Wieners. So talk about 1%. Your family and your name still seem to be held in such high regard. But what a dichotomy, because you've got people having this belief about the Jewish people as a whole, but they want to isolate you and go, oh, but not the Wieners. They're fine.
Exactly. Well, that is somewhat, you see something of a parallel in this country, where about the conspiracy theories that we have in this country. And it's not that people are in front of us. No, they're fine. But those other people out in those other states and they in the big cities, you know, whatever. And Democrats, instead of calling them Democrats, they call them socialist radicals, maybe even communists. I mean, it's you know, same kind of thing. You demonize people, and it catches on. That's why we have all this fuss about Facebook and Twitter and all that, where people get to something over and over and over again and say, well, it must be true. So I read it in the papers. I heard it on Fox, you know, and you become demonized. You catch that. It's almost like a germ that you, like a virus that you catch, and then you tend to hang with people who have that belief. Well, all my neighbors agree with that, so why wouldn't it be true?
Yeah,
it's very hard to combat that. You know, you gotta get the vaccine early on. If you wait too long, it's too late. So
that speaks so true to the. And I think this is going to be one of the key highlights from our time spent together, Richard, is that I want young Gen Zers and millennials to hear this, because we're actually preparing for an interview in a couple days talking about depolarization. And joining us is an educator out of Colorado named Benjamin Dancer, and he's been teaching since the Clinton era. And he shared with me, and we'll go into this in that episode once it launches on the podcast. He said that he has never witnessed more divisive separation in a cohort throughout through the Clinton era, the Bush, the Obama. He has never seen greater divides in his students than right now. He's seeing conservative kids getting bullied, being called homophobic, being called all these things because they, just for whatever reason, they're nurturing in nature, their environment they were raised in, you know, perhaps some of these concepts around LGBTQI or trans, perhaps they just haven't caught up yet. Or perhaps their home environment doesn't reflect the school environment. And so we have what I guess traditionally you wouldn't expect, the oppressed becoming the oppressors in some cases, in some instances. And we see that in the rise of Nazi Germany, right? Since the
peace treaty? Versailles?
The Treaty of Versailles. Thank you. The Treaty of Versailles, right? You have this narrative of the victims becoming the perpetrators, or, there's, again, it's hard to really
Yes.
pin any example up against
Yes.
what happened, the darkest period of Germany's history. So I'm not trying to draw any comparisons there. But what our conversation is bringing up for me, and what I hope some of these young kids can hear and see, is just how easy it is to identify an us and a them. And that throughout all text, through the Bible, there's this notion and idea of a zero-sum game in which there's these binaries of good and evil. And if you disagree with me, if you don't look like me, if you don't believe what I believe, if you don't act or behave like I act or behave, then you must be against me.
Right. And there's another side to that also, on the opposite end of the spectrum. If you are a boy who's somewhat effeminate, you might call it effeminate, who's a little bit sensitive and who likes, who likes theater and acting, but not so much football and such. And eventually somebody identifies him as, there was a famous movie called Tea and Sympathy. They called him Sissy Boy, and they finally decided, they made fun of the sissy boy. He's like a girly boy. Mm. And there was a girl in the town that put out, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. And
they arranged for him to prove his manhood by setting him up with this girl. Yeah. And of course, it was a total disaster because he just couldn't, he couldn't. She kind of insulted him. And he became stereotypes, as so many do. They become, once the bully boys identify you as a faggot or whatever, whether you are one or not, it's hard to shake that.
Yeah.
You become, that's the one, and you get isolated. You only hang out. Then you say, well, maybe I need to hang out with other boys who are in similar situations. Next thing you know, your whole life is turned upside down.
Yeah.
And that's another thing that I experienced at MKP. You deconstruct that whole past, and see miracles happen. That all of a sudden, I won't go into. We don't have the time. No. One particular kid who was absolutely, girly, and he ended up with his head held high. I am a man. It was like he walked out of there like proud and of his manhood. It was an amazing transformation. And so it's like when we came to America, being Jewish meant something different.
Yeah. And
I no longer worry about, am I less than? No, au contraire. I'm more than. Not to exaggerate. But in other words, I'm very proud of who I am. Mm-hmm. It's more about what I've accomplished in my life. And also my journey, which I guess we'll come to later. This is an important part of my story. And you need to tell me, Brandon, when we run out of time and need to that, right?
Yeah, no, totally. Well, hey, look, we can do a quick time check. We have 25 minutes left on our scheduled time together. Are you able to spill over a little bit?
Oh, I am, okay. But is the audience?
Is the audience? Oh, I bet you, I bet you they are. I bet you they're willing to stick around.
Okay, all right. Yeah. Well, hey, I talk as long as my voice lasts,
Yeah, and we have the ability to, Richard, to pick this up in a couple days and make it a part 1 and a part 2.
Holy smoke!
Yeah.
Right as soon as you said that, my fear of being a special boy went into effect.
Oh.
I don't want to be a special boy.
Whoa, wow. Well, hey, my name is Special Boy. Nice to meet you, Special Boy. Like I said, you're in good company. Well, in fact, Richard, I think this is a perfect point, actually. And I would love, lucky me, I would love the opportunity to tie you down in a couple days for a part 2 of this. But so how do you feel if I just ask you one more question before we wrap, and then in part 2 we can go deeper into the journey of forgiveness and reconciliation?
Okay. I'll have to look at my calendar to make sure what the time slot would be. Yes.
Yeah, no, we can work all that out. So
Yeah.
on this thread that we're talking about right now, I want to ask you, Richard, and your answer to this, I know will come with more weight once we hear more about your journey in our next sitting together. But what does it mean to connect with someone who actively resents, vilifies, and ultimately wanted to erase you and everyone like you? What does it mean to try and connect with someone like that?
The short answer is it's about me, not them. It's about letting go. And first of all, having a larger perspective on what it is to be a human being. That where I go to, and maybe it's because of my advanced age that I am able to be philosophical about this, that everyone was born, even Adolf Hitler was born an innocent baby, innocent child. He didn't know anything about the other, about racism, about who's good, who's bad. He was just, a baby. And it's what happened from that moment on that somewhat determined his path in life. Now, I happen to have been born of Jewish parents who happen to have a certain socioeconomic status, et cetera, et cetera. My parents happen to have a certain, they had their own shadows. They had their own. My mother was born in Poland and brought to Germany as a baby, things like that.
Sure.
And it so happened that was my environment and my upbringing. Others had a different story, and some of them had a dreadful story. I can only imagine what Trump's story must be. What kind of a childhood he had, what kind of a relationship with his father he had to turn out as he did. If you go to my Facebook page, I posted a video from Oprah Winfrey, very instructive, about her and her mother and how she ultimately, I don't want to go, anyone who can access my page, check out the video from Oprah Winfrey, who saw her mother on her deathbed and what happened there. Amazing story.
I'll make sure that it's linked in the show notes. Yeah,
it's a wonderful. I tear up every time I see it. I've seen it repeatedly, and so of course, the first impulse is to have, when somebody comes at me with hatred, fear, threats, etc. The first impulse is to go to safety. How do I get out of this situation? Anger. How dare he? What kind of a person is this? And how can such people still exist? And then after what I've learned at MKP, partly, and other experiences of my life, such as LifeSpring was a big one, I begin to see the other side of. There's a song called "I Can See It From Both Sides Now," so I can also see the little boy that became that threatening bully. To say, and I feel almost pity for him that he lives that life of hatred, and that's where he gets his jollies, and how sad that is. What a wasted life that is, And I feel some compassion, as I did, as you'll see in episode 2, for my Nazi classmates.
Yeah. Well, what better tease for the second part of this series? You've got me hooked, Richard. I'm hook, line, and sinker. I, not only having read through the book, and it hasn't been mentioned actually. So you sent me your book that you released in 2013, Survivor's Odyssey: From Oppression to Reconciliation. And I tell you, just as many people in the reviews have shared, it's such a rich, inspiring, you are there experience. And I'm a huge history fan. And I often seldom feel like I'm able to really connect with what's happening through the documentaries, the books, the podcast. Whereas this form of Holocaust canon, I feel like I'm there with you in how you tell your story, and the sections in which you go back to Wittenberg, and you go back to meet many of these children that tormented you, that were proud to be Jungvolk and to be part of the Hitler Youth. The stories to come in our next meeting are just truly remarkable, but also an opportunity to get into your personal journey, right? Raising a family and experiencing the many hardships that family life bring, and you're journeying into the Mankind Project at the ripe young age of 67 years old. So there's a lot more to dive into, and I'm incredibly eager and excited for that time we share together. But I think we've covered a lot of weighty material thus far, just in this first section of this interview.
Well, listen, I'm taking the next train to Chattanooga.
Hey, well, there's a pretty popular train here in Chattanooga you may know of.
Choo-choo. Yeah, I can sing the whole thing. Track 29.
Track 29.
Well, that was from the racist. That was a very racist, when you think about it, as a racist song, right? And boy, you can give me a shine. It's like back in the day when you had black railway porters and a certain class of jobs that blacks could get. And it was, so long as they knew their place, they were very polite and well spoken. What was that fashion Stephen Fetchit era in the movies, where blacks did get movie parts, but they were always servants. Yeah, that was Chattanooga Choo Choo.
Yeah. In retrospect, huh? It's it's pretty wild looking back into these stories and the history. And what I'm gaining so much from hearing you share, Richard, is just the value in retaining the historical facts and records of what's occurred, the acknowledgement, the awareness of what did happen, not censoring it, so that we're clear and in understanding of just what humans are capable of, just the atrocities. And
and I thought that also some people say, come on, it's not, why are you telling all this stuff about your on the road days, the Jack Kerouac days? Who was that? That's not part of the story. I said, yes, it is.
Mm-hmm.
It's part of how I dealt with my past. So, we get into that another time.
Yeah, we'll get into that. And because I want to know where the story goes from here.
Well, at 95, I have only got 10 more years to live a full life, and that's why I wrote it down in case I have memory loss, I can still read it. And by the way, I just want to mention that this book has gotten a little more notoriety because it's now gotten an honorable mention for the Eric Hoffer Book Award nonfiction category. I don't know if that. Where do you do that? Or did you?
I knew that. Yeah. I have it in my notes here. I'm going to be singing your praises when I record the intro and outro for this episode. But I think for now, Richard, I'm going to get you to stay on the line, but I'm just going to bless and thank our guests for being here and joining us today for this remarkable story and episode of the Mankind Podcast with Richard Wiener. You can get your hands on Survivor's Odyssey, From Oppression to Reconciliation, linked in the show notes, as well as all the other references we've shared and directed you to the show notes. You can get access to those as well. But Richard, mate, this has been such a treat and such a joy for me. Any final comments before we sign off?
And I want to thank you for your blessing and reticent presence, and making it a pleasure to go through this and to guide me through the minutiae of even getting online and all that. What would I have done without you? Brandon. You know, you're the indispensable guy to this episode.
Well, mate, it's been an absolute, I mean, the pleasure's just been all mine. And now I've got to figure out, where do I go about my day from here after hearing all of this and going through all of this? And I believe the answer to that is I'm gonna lead into this day with gratitude. Well, there you have it. Part one of what has been one of the most impactful experiences of my time spent in this podcast, spending time with Richard, hearing his stories. I mean, we're talking about a man at the age of 95 years old. This man witnessed unspeakable horrors happening in his homeland. He himself, his eyes were laid on Hitler himself when Hitler was doing his tours through Germany and sparking their revolution for the Third Reich. I mean, just to think that we get a chance to learn from a man like Richard, who's been able to come out the other side. I mean, wouldn't it be justified if Richard was the kind of person who spat venom and held anger and resentment towards those who did him, his family, his people wrong? Wouldn't it be justified? I tell you right now, I'd probably be sitting there nodding along saying, yeah, you have every right and reason to hold those feelings, those beliefs, and to remain angry and disgusted by those people that did you wrong and your family. But he chose a different path. He chose forgiveness, which, man, he's a greater man than I, because I don't think, I guess at this stage of life, that I'd be able to do that. But as Richard's reminding us through his storytelling, is that neither was he until he was able to live a little bit and learn. And whether through LifeSpring or the Mankind Project, he's been able to unpack his story over the years, in turn being able to help countless others be able to do the same and learn that holding resentment, holding anger and disdain towards others it's a formula for a very unhappy life. And so whatever that forgiveness mountain looks like for you, perhaps just taking your first step may be all you need to begin this journey from oppression to reconciliation, just like Richard has. Well, this has been part one. You can find in the show notes links that Richard and I mentioned. I'm making sure that they're in there for you. And we'll see you next week for the second part of our time spent with Richard Wiener here on the Mankind Podcast. Lots of love. See you next week. This has been another episode of the Mankind Podcast, produced in association with the Mankind Project USA. We have been your hosts, Paul Newell, Boyson Hodgson, and myself, Brandon Clift, and we want to thank our guests for joining us today and imparting their wisdom from their experiences in this amazing journey called life. If you want to find out more about today's guest and support them in their mission, you can find links to them in the show notes. Now, if you have found gold and insights that you believe could benefit your loved ones and those you care about, be sure to share it with them. And of course, we are always grateful for a rating and review of the show on iTunes. Now, we've got to give special thanks to our back-end team, producer, editor, and audio ninja for the show, Michael J. Russer, and Don Huff, who takes care of our graphics and promotions and pretty much makes us look pretty. So, of course, thank you, Don. Now, above all else, we've got to thank you, the listener, because through your attention and your support, you have made it possible for us to let men all over the world know that they are not alone and that there is more than one way to be a man. And if something in this episode has touched you, then perhaps it is the call to action to get involved in men's work. With live trainings happening constantly and in-person trainings happening all over the world, the Mankind Project definitely has something for you. Now, if you've enjoyed the music in this episode and all of our episodes, be sure to check out Jim Donovan and the Sun King Warriors. I have links to them in the show notes. And lastly, just know, what it means to me to be a man is completely different than what it means for you. What it means for Paul, what it means for Boyson, that is the beauty of this journey. So if you are looking for guidance, support, and community as you begin to unpack and dive deeper into your men's work journey, then you know where to find us. Same place, same time, next week. Lots of love. We'll see you then.